Most woodworking involves a table saw, the standard for making straight, clean cuts. The table saw is essentially a circular saw mounted in a table with the wood being pushed through for ripping and cross-cutting. It's the most accurate woodworking tool for ripping solid lumber and for cutting sheet materials. And it can be used with a variety of blades for special tasks and materials. This program has been divided into the following segments. We'll begin with safety and follow with getting to know your saw, blade assortment, basic cuts, accessories, and projects you can make. While the table saw is an exceedingly useful power tool, like all power tools, it can also be very dangerous if not used properly. Therefore, make sure you follow the general safety instructions for all power tools. Keep the power off except when you are actually using the saw. Make sure the yellow key is removed and the switch is in the off position before plugging in the cord. For your own protection, wear safety goggles whenever you're working around the saw. Don't wear loose clothing, jewelry, or watches. If you have long hair, tie it up or tuck it under a cap. And if you use the saw for hours at a time, wear hearing protectors and a dust mask. Make sure your work area is clean and well lighted. And since woodworking can be messy, it's a good practice to clean up as you work. One of the major hazards connected with the table saw is kickback. Kickback occurs when the teeth of the blade grab and throw the workpiece violently back out of the saw. The blade guard, the anti-kickback pawls, and the workpiece spreader are designed to reduce or eliminate the risk of injury from blade contact and workpiece kickback. The blade guard serves as a barrier to help keep hands from touching the blade. The anti-kickback pawls help reduce kickback by grabbing into and holding the workpiece. The spreader helps keep the kerf of the workpiece open, which helps prevent the blade from being pinched and causing workpiece kickback. To reduce the risk of being injured, make sure you always keep your face and body to one side of the saw blade. Keep your hands clear of the blade and out of its path. Make sure the blade guard is installed properly and aligned. Have the blade extend approximately 1/8 inch above the top of the workpiece. If the blade stalls or stops while cutting, turn the switch off before attempting to free the blade. Do not reach over or behind the blade to pull the workpiece through the cut. If your workpiece is large, make sure you have a supporting structure and don't try to support the piece yourself or allow anyone else to help you. Turn the saw off and wait for the blade to stop turning before picking up small pieces of cutoff material from the table. If a small piece of cutoff material is trapped inside the blade guard while the saw is running, turn the saw off. After the blade has stopped turning, lift the guard and remove the piece. Whenever you're using the table saw, you should use a fence or a miter gauge. When using the miter gauge, always lock it securely. Make sure you've removed the rip fence from the table. When using the rip fence, always lock it securely. Make sure you've removed the miter gauge from the table. While the saw is off, check the action of the anti-kickback pawls by passing the workpiece alongside of the spreader. Pull the workpiece toward you. If the pawls don't dig into the workpiece and hold it, you'll need to sharpen the pawls or replace them. Your owner's manual tells you how to do that, as well as giving you additional safety information and safety instructions. Make sure you read your manual and the safety labels on the saw. Saw controls vary from model to model. Refer to your owner's manual for specific instructions for your saw. Know the location and function of all controls before using the saw. The on-off switch is used to turn the saw on and off. Before turning the saw on, make sure you're standing to either side of the blade and that your hands are off the table. To turn the saw on, first insert the yellow key into the switch. Then put your finger under the switch lever and pull the end of the lever out. To turn the saw off, push the lever in. Lock the switch in the off position by holding the switch with one hand and removing the key with your other. Keep the key in a safe place away from the saw. For your own safety, always return the blade to a vertical 90-degree position and lower it below the table surface after turning the machine off. The elevation hand wheel raises and lowers the blade. Turn it clockwise to raise the blade and counterclockwise to lower it. The tilt hand wheel, which is located on the table side, tilts the blade for bevel cutting. Turn it clockwise to tilt toward the left and counterclockwise to tilt toward the right. When the blade is tilted to the left as far as it will go, it should be at 45 degrees to the table, and the bevel pointer should point to 45 degrees. There are limit stops inside the saw which prevent the blade from tilting beyond 45 degrees to the left and 90 degrees to the right. The tilt lock handle locks the blade in the desired tilt position. To change the tilt position, you must first loosen the tilt lock handle. To loosen it, turn the handle counterclockwise, push the handle in, and turn it to another position. Then to tighten, turn it clockwise. The workpiece is placed against the rip fence when you're measuring and cutting. When measuring for a rip cut, use a rip scale. To move the fence, lift the lock lever and grasp the fence with one hand at the front and move. On this model, the rip fence is locked in place by pushing the lock lever down until the lever rests on the stop. On other models, the rip fence is screwed down. Because the miter gauge acts as a guide when you're cross-cutting and mitering, it needs to be locked in position when doing either of these cuts. The miter gauge head is locked by tightening the lock knob. There are two slots for the stop pin at the 45-degree right and left positions. This makes it easy to set the miter gauge to cut miters. Slots are provided in the miter gauge for attaching an auxiliary facing to make it easier to cut long pieces. It is attached to the front of the miter gauge with screws. Make sure this auxiliary facing doesn't interfere with the proper operation of the saw blade guard. An auxiliary facing is simply a piece of smooth, straight wood with two holes drilled through it. When you're bevel cross-cutting, attach the facing so that it extends to the right of the miter gauge and use the miter gauge in the groove to the right of the blade. The blade guard is necessary for all cuts where the blade cuts completely through the workpiece. To remove the guard for special operations, loosen the thumb screw and slide the guard off of the other rod. Make sure you don't disturb the setting of the rod. When replacing the guard, make sure the pin in the rod engages with the notch in the spreader support, and make sure the thumb screw is tightened securely. The table insert can be removed to install blades or other cutting tools. For your own safety, turn the switch off and remove the plug from the power source outlet before removing the insert. To remove it, first lower the blade below the table surface. Raise the blade guard. Loosen the screw located at the end. Then lift the insert from the front end and pull it toward the front of the saw. Never operate the saw without the proper insert in place. Use the saw blade insert when sawing, and use the combination Dado molding insert when you're dadoing or molding. Before removing or installing a saw blade, turn the switch off and remove the plug from the power source. Setup, adjustment, and alignment procedures vary from model to model. The blade of your table saw must be installed and aligned properly. The specific instructions are in your owner's manual. The X-Acto cut is the yellow plastic disc embedded in the table in front of the saw blade. You can use it to mark the location of the saw cut on the workpiece. Cut off a piece of wood with the blade at 90 degrees or square to the table. Pull the miter gauge back until the wood is over the disc. Using a very sharp pencil, mark a line on the disc. With the miter gauge in the right-hand groove, cut another piece and mark a second line on the disc. These lines indicate the path of the cut or kerf made by the saw blade. You'll use them to line up the workpiece before cutting. You align the mark on the workpiece to be cut to the line on the X-Acto-Cut and make the cut. In order to make your cuts as accurate as possible, you'll want to adjust and align your table saw. Your owner's manual gives you the step-by-step procedure you should follow, but I'd just like to mention the major points now. You'll want to make sure the saw blade is parallel to the miter gauge groove and the rip fence. If the blade isn't parallel, when you rip, it may cause binding or kickback. When you cross-cut, it may cause splintering, burning, tooth marks, binding, or kickback. Another alignment involves the blade tilt, making sure it makes a square cut when the bevel pointer is pointing directly to the 0 mark on the bevel scale. You'll also want to make sure the hand wheel turns freely without binding. And you may want to adjust the miter gauge head for those situations where extreme accuracy is required. Your owner's manual gives you detailed instructions on how to make all these alignments and adjustments. Before making any adjustments, be sure to turn the switch off and remove the plug from the power source outlet. Blades are classified according to the different type of cutting they can do. This is determined by the size and shape of the blade teeth and gullets. The gullet is the gap in between the teeth. The blade that comes with the saw is usually a combination blade, which means it can be used for both cross-cutting and ripping. Cut-off blades have finer teeth than combination blades and are used for very clean cross-cutting. Ripping blades have wide chisel-like teeth that won't bog down when following the grain. If you use a lot of plywood, you might want to try the plywood blade. Its fine teeth don't splinter thin veneers. Carbide-tipped blades stay sharp much longer than the standard steel blades. However, they cost more. Blades should be reconditioned or discarded if they are dull, damaged with teeth bent or knocked off, warped or gummed. If your blade is cracked, throw it away. The table saw can be used for a number of different cuts. We'll be going over cross-cuts, repetitive cutting, ripping, miter cutting, bevel cross-cutting, compound miter cutting, bevel ripping, resawing, and rabbiting. In order to do some of these cuts, you'll need to have a push stick, a push block, and an auxiliary fence work support. Cross-cutting is cutting the wood across the grain at 90 degrees. It's done with the miter gauge set at 0. It's a good idea to glue a piece of sandpaper to the face of the miter gauge head. This will help prevent the workpiece from creeping while it's being cut. You can also use a hold-down clamp on the miter gauge for greater accuracy. The miter gauge may be used in either of the grooves in the table. For maximum accuracy, always favor one side of the groove. Keep one side of the bar riding against one side of the groove. Make sure the miter gauge is locked before you begin. When using the miter gauge in the left-hand groove, hold the workpiece firmly against the miter gauge head with your left hand and grip the lock handle with your right. When using the right-hand groove, hold the workpiece with your right hand and the lock handle with your left. Turn the saw on. Make sure you have your safety goggles on. Make the cut. If your workpiece is long, you'll want to support it. You can use the auxiliary fence work support, or you can make a simple support by clamping a piece of plywood to a sawhorse. Sometimes you'll want to cut a number of pieces the same length without having to mark each piece. When making repetitive cuts shorter than 6 inches, clamp a block of wood 2 inches long to the table to act as a length stop. Place a small block of wood between the bottom edge of the table and the C-clamp. Don't clamp directly to the bottom edge of the table because the swivel of the clamp won't grip properly. Or use a stop rod accessory. Don't ever use the rip fence as a length stop because the cutoff piece could bind between the fence and the blade. Slide the workpiece along the miter gauge until it touches the block. Hold it securely or clamp it with the hold-down clamp. Make the cut. Ripping is cutting a piece of wood with the grain or lengthwise. In order to do a rip cut, you'll use the rip fence. Using the rip scale, position the fence to the desired width of the rip and lock it in place. Make sure the rip fence is parallel to the saw blade, the spreader is properly aligned with the saw blade, and the anti-kickback pawls are functioning properly. As you make a rip cut, watch the position of the workpiece against the fence. This is your reference for cutting and not watching the blade. If your board is long, always use a work support. When the width of the rip is narrower than 2 inches, you'll need to use the auxiliary fence work support and the push block. Attach the auxiliary fence work support to the rip fence with 2 C-clamps. Then feed the workpiece by hand along the auxiliary fence until the end is approximately 1 inch past the front edge of the table. Hold the workpiece in position and slide the push block on top of the auxiliary fence work support. Continue to feed using the push block. There's a possibility of narrow strips thicker than the auxiliary fence work support entering the guard and striking the baffle. Carefully raise the guard only enough to clear the workpiece. Use the push block to complete the cut. Miter cutting is cutting the wood at an angle other than 90 degrees. To do a miter cut, adjust the miter gauge to the desired angle, in this case 30 degrees, and lock it. Hold the workpiece firmly against the miter gauge head with one hand and grip the lock handle with the other. Make the cut. With bevel cross-cutting, the edge of the wood is cut at an angle. To do a bevel cross-cut, adjust the blade to the desired angle, in this case 30 degrees. If you try to use the miter gauge in the groove to the left, you can see how the blade guard will interfere. So use the miter gauge in the groove to the right of the blade. Hold the workpiece with your right hand and the lock handle with your left. Then make the cut. A compound cut is a combination of a miter and a bevel cut. The cut is made at an angle other than 90 degrees to both the edge and the flat side of the wood. To make a compound cut, adjust the miter gauge to the desired angle, in this case 35.5 degrees, and then adjust the blade to the desired angle, 30 degrees. Make sure the miter gauge is locked. Use the miter gauge in the groove to the right of the blade. Hold the workpiece with your right hand and the lock handle with your left. Then make the cut. A bevel rip cut is cutting a piece of wood lengthwise and cutting the edge at an angle. When the width of the rip is 6 inches and wider, use your right hand to feed the workpiece until it is clear of the table. Your left hand should only be used to guide the workpiece, not feed it. When bevel ripping materials 6 inches or narrower, use the fence on the right side of the blade only. This way you'll have more space between the fence and the saw blade for the use of a push stick. If the fence is mounted to the left, the saw blade guard may interfere with using the push stick. When the width of the rip is 2 to 6 inches, use the push stick to feed the work. Resawing is ripping a piece of wood through its thickness. Don't attempt to resaw bowed or warped material. Remove the blade guard and use the auxiliary fence work support. Don't ever back up while resawing. It could cause kickback. Put the blade guard back on immediately after completing the resawing operation. Rabbiting is cutting out a section of the corner of a piece of material along an end or along an edge. Because rabbit cuts don't go all the way through the material, the blade guard must be removed. If you want to rabbit along an edge, add facing to the rip fence approximately as high as the workpiece is wide. Then adjust the rip fence and blade to the required dimensions. Use feather boards as well. Make the first cut with the board flat on the table, like a rip cut. The second cut with the workpiece on edge. There are various accessories that can be used with the table saw that allow you to do a number of different things. We'll be going over the use of the dado head, the molding head, and universal jig. A universal jig allows you to make a variety of cuts, from standard cuts to dado and joint cuts. It slides along the miter groove and it holds the workpiece with adjustable clamps. It also has a metal scale to accurately measure the cuts. The dado blade makes a groove or a square-sided notch in the workpiece. It does not cut all the way through the stock. The dado head consists of a set of blades, typically 2 outside 1/8 inch blades and 5 inside chipper blades, 4 of which are 1/8 inch and 1 1/16 inch. By varying the combination of these blades, you can vary the width of the dado cut. A new Excalibur blade allows the changing of this width by dialing it in. The unit does not have to be removed from the arbor. When using the dado head and molding head, it's necessary to remove the blade guard and spreader. Make sure you replace them when you're finished dadoing. For the dado blade, you need to use a dado insert. When installing the dado, see your owner's manual or accessory guide for proper instructions. Make sure the cutting teeth are pointed in the direction of the rotation of the motor. Then put the chipper blades on, making sure that the cutting edge of the chipper blade is alongside a gullet in the outside blade. Space the chipper blades and then install the other outside blade. You don't have to install the outside loose collar before screwing on the arbor nut. Make sure the arbor nut is tight. When using a dado blade for a crosscut or rabbet, make sure you use a miter gauge and that you lock it securely. Remember, the crosscut is across the grain, and the rabbet is made along the end of the workpiece. You need to use a rip fence when cutting with the grain of the wood. If the piece is 6 inches or less, use feather boards as well. The dado blade allows you to cut a rabbet along the edge or a groove down the middle of the wood. The molding head is used to mold or shape edges. It has a number of different cutters in the standard molding shapes, which allow you to make decorative edgings, as well as a number of different cuts. When installing the molding head, see your owner's manual or accessory guide for proper instructions. Before you start the saw, rotate the head by hand to make sure it doesn't touch or bind any part of the table or insert. There are holes in the rip fence for attaching a wood facing, which you need when using the molding head. Use a piece of smooth, straight wood approximately 3/4 of an inch thick, and the same size as the rip vents for your facing. You also need some hold-downs, which are devices that hold the work against the fence. When you're ready to cut, feed the work into the cutter bits slowly and against the direction of rotation. On deeper molding cuts, take 2 or 3 shallow passes rather than one deep cut. With a table saw, you can build a number of projects, from picture frames to drawers. One of the simplest projects to make is a frame. A shadow box picture frame uses a number of different cuts. A compound cut provides the joint. You begin by making your molding. Carefully measure for width, and then do your rip cuts. Make your dado cuts. Now you're going to make a compound cut with a 35.5-degree miter and a 30-degree bevel. Glue the joints, and you have a lovely shadow box frame. Another easy joint is the spline joint. It can be used to reinforce the miter. The first step in making a spline joint is to cut 45-degree miters on each workpiece. Position one of the mitered pieces in the universal jig. Crosscut to make the actual spline cut. And then make the spline. Now you have a spline joint. A lap joint can be cut by a dado. When cutting a lap joint with a dado blade, you may have to make more than one pass. Another easy project is a bookcase. You use crosscuts to cut the boards to length. And you'll be making dado cuts so the shelves can just slide in. For the top, let's make a simple rabbet, which is a dado cut along the edge. Here's how it fits together. A drawer may seem complicated, but it's actually quite an easy project to make with a table saw. Generally, the bottom is a piece of plywood that you cut to length and width. Then use a dado head to cut the groove for the drawer bottom in the side, front, and back pieces. Check the groove size with the stock being used for the drawer bottom. Drawers can be joined with many different kinds of joints. On this flush drawer, we're using a rabbet joint. A few cuts, and your drawer is complete. With the table saw, you have a power tool that allows you to rip, cross-cut, cut joints, and shape wood. By using your table saw properly, and by following the alignment and maintenance instructions in your owner's manual, you'll have an efficient, versatile power tool that will help you build the projects you want to make. In the second part of this tape, you'll learn how to use your Craftsman table saw to make this handsome lamp table. This lamp table is made of pine and has tapered legs ripped from 2x4s. The sides are made from 1x4s, and the top is made by gluing together boards of random width. For the purposes of this demonstration, we have pre-built the table in several stages. This way, it will be easier for you to follow the progression as we go through it. Make sure that you view this entire tape before beginning the project. We've also included printed project plans with this videotape. For this project, you'll need the lumber or stock listed on the bill of materials, as shown here. In making this table, we'll be using several Craftsman accessories, including a taper jig, a universal jig, a molding head and cutters, a hold-down device, a drill press mortising kit, a router table, and an extension table. For fine furniture making, we suggest using a Craftsman Excalibur Master Combination blade for the basic cuts. To begin, Measure and cut the side rails to length. Follow the dimensions indicated on the project plans. Next, cut the back end rail. Then cut another piece of wood the same length as the back rail. This board will later be ripped to form the drawer rails on the front of the table. Remove the miter gauge. Set the rip fence to 1 1/4 inches. Lock the rip fence in place. Lower the guard, and while using a proper push stick, cut the board. Now adjust the rip fence to the width for the drawer slides and make the cut. Next, we'll cut the rabbet for the drawer to slide on using the hold-down device. The auxiliary fence should be constructed according to the plans included with the device. Do not attempt to make this cut without the hold-down device. With the hold-down device in place and properly adjusted, cut the rabbet. Next, cut the groove that runs along the edge of the side rails. This is a 3/8 inch deep groove. It allows you to attach the tabletop fasteners. For the legs, we'll cross-cut a 2x4 to length, then rip both boards to make 4 legs. Mortise placement is next. Identify and lay out all 4 legs. Each of the 2 front legs will have 1 conventional mortise for the side rails and 2 square mortises to accommodate the 2 drawer rails. Mark the face of the left and right leg rails. The back leg mortises are identical. They have the same type of mortise to accept the back and side rails. For mortising, we will use the Craftsman mortising kit, which comes with a 3/8 inch bit and a squaring chisel. The stripper should be adjusted so that it is just touching the wood. The wood should be able to slide back and forth. Set the depth stop at a 1/2 inch as noted in your project plans and drill all mortises. Next, turn off the drill press and unplug it. Then insert the squaring chisel and simply lower and raise the yoke to square off the mortise. Now, lay out the tenons according to the dimensions on your project plans. All mortises are 1/2 inch deep, and tenons are 3/8 of an inch deep. Next, make shoulder cuts using a miter gauge and a stop block. A stop block is simply a piece of wood clamped to the rip fence that allows you to make several cuts with an identical measurement. Remove the guard, since this is not a through cut. Finish cutting the ends of the tenons using the universal jig. This jig can be used only on table saws. After the stock is clamped in place, adjust the tenon over to the layout line, tighten the hand knob, and lift the blade guard. Now stand to one side and cut. Turn the stock around, reclamp, and cut the same way. Next, cut off the ends of the tenons using the universal jig turned to a 90-degree angle. Then turn the board around and cut the other slot. Always make sure that the saw comes to a complete stop before making adjustments. Using a hand saw or chisel, cut off the 2 outside bits of scrap. Now onto the legs. To taper each leg, we'll again have to move the rip fence and lift the guard while setting up the taper jig. You will be tapering the sides that have the mortises cut into them. Mark 4 1/2 inches from the end of the leg. This is where the taper will start. With the saw unplugged, Place the taper jig at the desired angle, which in this case is 3 degrees. Place the top of the leg where the mortise is at the front of the taper jig. Move the rip fence over to the taper jig and lock the fence in place. When the adjustment is complete, put the guard down, plug in the saw, and make the cut. When cutting the taper, begin with one mortise on the table and one mortise facing the blade. Then you'll be able to rotate the leg a quarter of a turn to taper the next side. After tapering all 4 legs, you're ready to assemble the table frame. Assemble the 2 front legs to the front drawer rails. Then assemble the back legs. After the front and back leg sections dry, fit the sections together with the side rails. Make sure the table is square, glue and clamp it, and set it aside. When the glue is dry, the next step is to fasten the drawer slides to the sides. Mark 3 holes in each slide, placing 1 hole an inch from each end and 1 in the middle. Drill and countersink the holes. Position the drawer slides so that the bottom of the previously cut rabbet is flush with the top of the bottom drawer rail, and attach the slides. Now you're ready to construct the drawer. All drawer parts use either 1/2 or 3/8 inch stock ripped to size. Be sure that the drawer opening is at least 1/8 of an inch larger than the drawer, so that the drawer will operate smoothly and cleanly. First, cut a 1/8 inch groove in the sides, front, and back of the drawer for the drawer bottom to rest on. To assemble the drawer, we'll use a rabbet cut for the front and back, and matching dado grooves in the sides. Use a twin-blade Excalibur dado and the miter gauge to make these cuts. Now cut the dado grooves and rabbets. Use a stop block when cutting the dados. Check the dados and rabbets for fit. They must fit snugly. A good way to ensure this is to make trial cuts on scrap lumber before cutting your good stock. Next, cut the bottom to size and glue and assemble the drawer. Then measure and cut a front. We suggest a 3/4 inch pine stock. Finish the edge around the drawer front using a router table and a 3/8 of an inch round-over bit with a ball-bearing pilot. Unplug the router while setting up. Make the end grain cuts first and the width grain cuts second. Always use a push shoe to keep your hands safely away from the cutter. Mark and drill 2 holes through the drawer front according to the measurements on your project plans. Center the drawer face on the drawer front and attach it with wood screws. The next procedure is to make the table top. Glue together a combination of 1x materials in order to create the size top needed. Before you glue, make sure that the edges to be glued are square to the surface. Also, mark the growth rings. Line the boards up with an alternating pattern of rings to prevent warping. Glue and clamp the boards with bar clamps to keep the edges flush. Take your time on this. The completed tabletop should look like one piece of wood. After the glue has set, take off the clamps and square the board. Do this by ripping both edges slightly, then rip to the proper length and cut to the desired width. The next step is to put a finished edge on the tabletop. To do this, use a molding head with decorative edge cutters. Be sure to use a hold-down device when making these cuts. Only remove 1/16 of an inch from the edge on each pass. It will take several passes to complete the operation. You can achieve the smoothest possible cut by taking off 1/32 of an inch on the final pass. If you do this, you will minimize the need for extra sanding. Now you can attach the top with the tabletop fasteners. Sand the assembled table, then stain or paint it, and your project is complete.